Wouldn't it be amazing if we could use artificial intelligence to get matched with the perfect guest for our interview podcast? Hey Siri, can you find me a guest for my podcast?
Sorry, I can't search your podcasts.
Well, I've got good news for you. Today's episode of Podcast Therapy is all about Podmatch. Now, Podmatch is a service that uses artificial intelligence to automatically match you with the best guests so you can create high-quality interviews for your podcast. Now, I've got the founder, Alex Sanfilippo. He is a rock star podcaster. He runs creatingabrand.com, Podmatch, and he has a very successful interview podcast. Now, in this episode, he's going to share with you how he got Seth Godin on his podcast. He's going to share with you some amazing podcast interview etiquette tips, and of course, how to pitch yourself and get better guests overall. So if you're looking to get more guests, high quality guests for your interview podcast, you don't want to miss this episode. So I recently read this book called AI Superpowers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book, but it's a deep dive into the race between China and the United States and AI. What got you particularly interested in AI, using AI with your new tool, Podmatch?
Well, that book makes it sound a lot more intense than I was ever thinking. First off, I have not heard of that book, but for us, it was the realization that we needed to offer something to this market that has only been offered on a hand-to-hand basis, human-to-human basis. And that's the booking agents of the world, which are fantastic. But you and I know, and so does even the booking agents, it's not for 95% of people. Most people can't afford it. It doesn't make sense for their business or anything like that. So when we had the idea for Podmatch, we knew that we wanted to somehow help people find their ideal guest or the ideal host to have them. But there was no way we could give a hands-on experience and not have a crazy cost to go with that. So we decided we have to develop something that's going to get smarter as time goes on, right? That's the idea of AI. Can it get smarter? Can it have a matching core that puts people together that are the right fit for each other? And that was really our whole basis behind it. It was something I knew nothing about going into it. Thankfully, I have a business partner that's, I like to think he's a little bit smarter than I am. So he kind of had some of this already figured out, and he'd done work like this before. And the idea was, can we build something that is very similar to these online dating apps that everyone uses? They have an algorithm as well. They have something that works to put people together. Can we use that same type of tech as long as it's not proprietary information, right? Anything that's public knowledge on how to make that work. And that's exactly what we did with this.
Oh, it's so wonderful. And, AI, I highly recommend you get this book because it basically shares how these companies and what they're doing and how, the WeChat app revolutionized China and the way they spend money and the way they gather data. Are there any other trends you see in podcasting where AI might jump in and help us like Podmatch has?
Yeah, a lot of it, the thing I like about podcasting is it's one person talking to an audience, right? So I don't know where all the applications are going to be for this sort of thing. I do see that there's a lot of opportunity to optimize a lot more of what's happening. But as far as having AI involvement, I'm really not sure. The only place I've really seen that I will say that would be very interesting to see somebody work in, which is not the space I'm in, but actually having something that will give an algorithm out there that's helping a listener find the ideal podcast without having to search for anything. Could I just say, here's who I am? Can it go ahead and scrape my LinkedIn somehow and say, here's 10 recommendations for you? I might have just given someone $1 million idea right there.
Yeah, I think you did. I think I'm scribbling down some notes over here. Yeah,
tackling that's a big task.
Yeah, so putting intelligence behind curation
Yes.
for listeners, that sounds like an amazing future. So what I really love about you is that you didn't just start a podcast matching tool for podcasters to get have an easier way to get interviews, but you're actually a podcaster yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the Creating a Brand podcast, you've interviewed some amazing people like Seth Godin, John Lee Dumas, Jay Baer, the list goes on and on. So which came first? Was it podcasting first for you, and then you realized that there was an opportunity for you to build this tool for people? Or did you always have it in the back of your head that you were going to make something for podcasters?
I started humbly from a place of I wanted to do a podcast. Is how it started. And so I just kind of listened around to see if I could find podcasts that I liked, that I wanted it to sound like. And I just wasn't finding exactly what I was looking for. So I decided to do Creating a Brand and really just made it to serve a handful of people that I knew would like it. And that's always been my focus. People are like, how many downloads you have? And I probably don't look as much as I should. But really, I know that the few people that it really is made for, it's reaching, because I hear from those people on a regular basis. And that means everything to me. So for me, as I got into podcasting, it's kind of scary to get into, right? Like day one, you're like, okay, I need like 100 different things. And what the heck is Apple? And how do I get something on there, right? Like those are the things that we
Yeah.
all think about and are challenged with. And I want to say this about this industry as a whole. Some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life and most helpful people I've ever met in my life are in the podcasting space. And I fell in love with how people are. And I come from a background of the aerospace industry, which is cutthroat. I mean, if you work with somebody, they don't want you to get too close because they're like, I could get the next promotion when this company grows to do another $1 billion. Or if they're outside that company, they're like, I'll kill you if you call one of my customers, right? Like, for lack
Yeah.
of a better term. So when I came into this space, I'm like, oh my gosh, these people are amazing. And so I just kind of developed this attitude of I want to help serve these people because so many of them have helped me freely. And my podcast has done really well. And I say that very humbly. And I say it because other people have helped me along the way, I mean, including this podcast. I mean, podcast therapy is awesome. And quick shout out to you. You just recently did an episode
Thank
where you
you.
shared 5 points about reviewing your podcast process. And I'm guessing you do that every single year. That really spoke to me, and that's going to help me make my podcast even better in the new year. So thank you for that. And that's the perfect
Awesome.
example of what it's done for me. So when I just realized so many people were serving here, I wanted to see if I could find a need. So I actually went to Podfest Multimedia Expo at the beginning of 2020. It was like the last conference ever to be in
I was
person.
there too.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah, there was right before, like right when the pandemic hit,
Yes.
it was like you could get a sticker on your badge that said like, I'm not comfortable shaking hands.
I hugged all
Huh, we
those
must
people
have
and I feel
crossed paths.
terrible now. Like they're wearing, I'm like, get over here. You're getting a hug anyway. And, but while I was there and you were there, I was actually asking people, hey, what are you struggling with in podcasting? Just to see if there was a need or if I could just at least help network and put people together that needed each other. And I found in that room, there's about 2,000 people there, as you might remember. And on one side of the room, there was authors showing up that didn't have podcasts, but they wanted to talk about their new book. And the other side, there was podcast hosts that were, some of them were a little bit newer, a little bit more experienced, but were having a really hard time narrowing down their ideal audience. And that's kind of when it clicked for me that, okay, there's got to be a way to connect these people together. And I was like, oh, I got it. Booking agents. Let's just put them in touch with those people. So I started doing that. And they're like, I don't have 15 grand to spend in a year or 10 grand to spend a year, whatever it costs. And I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, and from there, it just went to these whiteboards that are behind me where I'm talking right now. Like these whiteboards, I remember I was holding a kettlebell the night that I got the idea, and I ran inside, just whiteboarded the whole idea out, and immediately called an old business partner of mine that I hadn't worked with in a couple of years and told him, hey, man, we got to go for this. And he totally agreed. And the rest is kind of history. And that's how we started this thing. So Podmatch came to be from really just seeing a need and wanting to meet it and to serve an industry that I care so much about.
Awesome. So if you're listening right now, you might be saying, I don't even know what Podmatch is. So I want to give you the opportunity to give the pitch. I have it written down here, but I think it comes much better from the creator himself. What exactly is Podmatch?
Yeah, I'm like super curious to hear what you wrote down, but I'll give mine real quick. So, Podmatch is an AI-driven program that basically is going to match you to your most ideal guest or most ideal host. It takes all of the guesswork out of it. There's no more searching through directories or asking a lot of people questions. From here, you can find the people we've matched you with, and you can either pass on those or decide to match with them. You can message them right there. You can do all the scheduling A to Z without ever having to exchange an email, just with inside the Podmatch ecosystem.
Yeah, I had written down painless interview matching.
I like that.
Just as sort of
I
my
like that.
three words. And before we got on the call here, we were sort of comparing it to online dating, where you have a service that is actually sort of working for you to make a match for you. And one of my biggest complaints with some of the other platforms is, you really have to spend a lot of time digging through them in order to find the right match. And when I set up my Podmatch account, I immediately got matched with people that were relevant and that I wanted to have on my podcast without really having to do anything but, trying to improve my profile. So, it's an amazing tool. It's a free tool, and we'll put a link that you can click in the notes and just go check it out and make yourself an account and start automatically getting matched with. I think relevant is the
Yeah.
most important thing. You can create an account on other places and you get all kinds of different people that aren't really part of the core message or the core audience you're trying to hit. So I just really love that. And there's one other thing. So I want to go back to, you talked about Podfest, and when you go on the Podmatch website, there's one word that sticks out to me that is a theme throughout podcasting and the podcasting community. It's community, right? And you're really focused on creating community around Podmatch. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more. I know we talked about how podcasters are awesome and we're all collaborative,
Yeah.
and this is a theme that comes up on the podcast. But what made you decide that you're not just going to make a tool for people, but you're going to grow a community within that?
Yeah. So for me, again, all this came back from people just being willing to help me. And all that started off as outreach. And podcasting is one dimensional. I mean, Travis, you and me may not, I guess podcasters listen to this. So this one might be a little bit different. But my podcast, and maybe if you have another one that you do as well, you don't necessarily hear from a lot of your listeners. And it's very one dimensional. So it can be a bit of a lonely space for people. So for me, I just know the power of community in my life has always helped me to go further faster. So everything I do, I try to incorporate community somehow, some way. And I understand that not everyone's looking for that, but if people are, we definitely wanted to have that option. So yeah, part of Podmatch is there's a community. We built it on Mighty Networks, which I think is a really clean platform for building community. And we've got that there. We list like all the different events that are happening around the place. We list resources and stuff like that. It's just really important to us to make sure that we do that. There's a quote by Helen Keller that I quote all the time, but she said that alone we can do so little, but together we can do so much. And I've always just held on to that. And I want to make sure I incorporate that anywhere that I ever am.
That's amazing. And I think there's two like subset thought groups in, I think, any industry. And there's the ones that realize that there's enough for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the ones that stay proprietary and don't want to share anything. And, if you help other people, you will get the things in life that you want. And so by collaborating and realizing that there's 8 billion pairs of ears out there, and that you really actually don't need them all to
Right.
be a successful podcaster,
Yeah.
do you know who Kevin Kelly is? The 1000 True
Oh,
Fans?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, this is something that comes up a lot, is that you really only need about 1,000 true fans to give you about $100 a year to make a living at podcasting or being an artist or being a musician. And so to think that you need to capture all 8 billion people is crazy. So there's enough for everybody. There's enough people listening for everyone. And that's where the community aspect comes in. And collaboration is a big part of interviews, right? So when I reached out to you, if you were closed off and not a collaborator, you would have made an excuse or
Right.
brushed me off. But it's all about collaboration and networking, which you seem to be a master at networking. Can I get your thought process? Because I think the way I connected with you was actually through LinkedIn, and it seems like you spend a lot of time foraging for and developing new relationships.
Yeah, I absolutely do. And you know what's funny? If this was 8 months ago, actually, I shouldn't say it's funny. This is kind of sad. 8 months ago, I would not have reached out to you on LinkedIn because I could have just kept on going to the networking events in my city and traveled around to go to networking events. But I had to turn to something. I'm like addicted to it now, like you can just see the
Yeah.
power of it. So for me, networking it all comes back down to being a connector. And I find that there's nothing more joyful for me than helping other people get connected. And I think that some people have this, like you're talking about, like maybe more of a competitive mindset that we're like, well, if I introduce Travis to this person, that person's going to get on the podcast instead of me. Like I shouldn't do that. The truth is, when you look out for other people, man, something just happens. Doors open for you. And ever since I got this mindset years ago, again, I come from a very competitive industry. So for a while, I was kind of closed off to that. But now I try my best to be as open as I possibly can and just introduce people and be that connector. And I have found more doors open than you could imagine from just doing that. So my idea of networking is maybe somebody has a very simple problem that I have a solution for. And can I help them solve that? Not saying I'm a genius, but maybe I just know somebody. Like perfect example, I've used pod decks a lot. Like I'm a customer of yours. And when people are like especially new to doing interviews, and they're like, oh, I'm having trouble like asking good questions, I have a resource. Like I can immediately send it to them. And that doesn't make
Yeah.
me any smarter. I'm just the guy who pointed them that way. But later on, when one of their friends is like, ooh, I think I need a coach. They might be like, ooh, this guy, Alex, he's really smart. And all I did was push them from A to Z. And I find that
Yep.
just be really helpful. And it's not why I do it. I do it because I deeply care about people. There's something that I say, it's on my whiteboard behind me. One of them, I've got three, because I'll reference these whiteboards a lot. But I say that Alex Sanfilippo seeks to be a person of value, not a person of profit. And I truly mean that. I'm here to be a person of value for other people, not just to make money off of them, because that's just my deep rooted conviction is to serve others.
I love that. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's the exact credo that I have in my business is, people before profit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the community. It's not about making money. It's about elevating others and helping them reach their goals. So that's amazing. And I really love that. And you seem, I don't know you from the aerospace world, but I would be willing to bet you're way more happy and you seem illuminated now by this opportunity of becoming a catalyst and Do you feel like that's true? Do you feel free of that competitive nature?
Yeah, it's something I mean, it became part of who I was. Like, I started doing the personality test, and over times I replaced what used to be learner with competitive. And that was just me being in the space I was in, which is kind of crazy to think that my personality was changing because of the industry I was in. And there's nothing wrong with that industry. Some people absolutely love it and they don't develop that mindset. I just couldn't overcome it for some reason. And it's interesting. I'll share this real quick. We talked about this offline, but I just interviewed Dr. Gay Hendricks yesterday, and he has the book called The Big Leap. And in it, he talks about your zone of excellence and your zone of genius. What I found is, for years, I was stuck in that zone of excellence. I was good at what I was doing in the aerospace industry. I worked my way up to a senior director of a publicly traded multi-billion-dollar company. Like, I was doing really well, but I was never using my zone of genius, just excellence. And when I actually shifted, and I'm actually now full-time podcasting between Podmatch and creating a brand. When I made that shift, I moved into my genius zone, and I really began finding places that were like that deeper rooted personality that I once had that have started coming back now that I'm out of a super competitive environment. And that's probably a longer answer you're looking for, but I think it was important to
Oh,
share.
I think that's amazing. It makes me very happy that you've been able to transition like that and get into the genius zone, because I think a lot of people, spend too much time trying to make things perfect, especially
Hmm.
podcasters, instead of making progress. And Poddex was started on accident. And if I hadn't taken a leap to do one thing, I wouldn't have stumbled upon the next, which led me here today. So you have to take chances, and you have to take risks, and you have to find ways to let your true self be illuminated through that. And it's just great to see. So speaking of networking, if you could sit on a plane for a 9-hour flight with anybody, and the idea here is that you're going to actually interact with that person, who would that be?
Yeah, right now, I really think that Brendan Bouchard would be somebody I'd be interested in. That's probably a really common response that you hear. And there's a lot of great leaders that are very similar to him. A while ago, actually, before I left the aerospace industry, I picked up his book, though, the High Performance Habits is what it was called. And I read through that, and it actually really helped me understand that the area that I wasn't a high performer was my courage. And that's what I was lacking to make a change. Like, courage is a big deal. Like, you started Poddex and this podcast because you were courageous in that area and decided to take the risk. And that's the area I was most lacking in. And maybe it was just the comfort of the corporate world or something like that. I don't know what it was, but it's what made me realize I need to take that leap. So Brendan Bouchard would be the person I'd love to just see if I could learn even more from in this season of life that I'm in.
Awesome. And you've referenced several books. I'm an avid reader. What one book do you think belongs on everybody's bookshelf?
As a believer, I have to say the Bible. I will pass on that one because that's the automatic answer. So everyone just know that's where I stand with that. I think in the world we live in today, probably the most important is this book titled Indistractable by Nir Eyal. Indistractable. And the reason I think it's so important is because we live in a world that is just bombarded by distraction. And whether that be the things everyone thinks of immediately, right? Social media, TV, it can be other things. It can be busy work. It can be email. There's so many things we're distracted by. And we have to learn to stop making time for those like being distractible. And we have to start being
Yep.
indistractable by actually focusing on traction. And that book really, really spoke to me. And I've been saying that all year. That's the one that needs to be on every business and every home as well.
That's awesome. I have not heard of that book, and I cannot wait to devour it,
It's
because,
great.
as somebody who's trying to build a business or a podcast, it's very easy to say, I'm going to do the easy things that make me feel like I'm getting momentum, but we
Right.
avoid eating the frog, so to speak. We avoid doing the hard work. And those are the things that sort of freak you out, are the things that you really need to do to break through to the next level. So that sounds absolutely incredible. So I was on Podmatch the other day, and you've created a bunch of mini courses or mini tutorial videos. And so I wanted to see if we could share some of the information that people may not have been on Podmatch with. So, as an expert in sort of connecting people, what do you think is the best way to pitch a guest? Because I think podcasters do different things. They'll DM people or they'll send emails. And I have my own thoughts on this that I share in other podcasts. But what do you think is the best way to pitch a potential guest?
Yeah, so if you're, and I've done this really wrong, I have to say this is a learned skill for sure. I'm probably close to 90 episodes in on what I've had recorded. If you go back to episode 1 and look at the pitch I sent, like, I want to rip it up. I mean, it was on the internet, but I want to punch my computer screen or something. It was bad. So, like, this is a learned skill, and I think you get better at it over time. Something like Podmatch really helps out. I'm not trying to push people to that necessarily, but because you actually have a one sheet for for yourself as a guest. And also the host of the podcast has an overview of it. So it automatically allows you to message somebody and share much less information than a lot of people try to do. So a few things I'll mention not to do. Don't say, hey, I want you to be on my podcast. Like if you just say, it's like, okay, why, like what's the reasoning? And the other thing is, don't give a massive like 10-page pitches or like reason, like here's why and here's all the things about my history, here's what I did when I was a kid and what led me to where I am. Like all that stuff is nice, but most of these people that you reach out to, they're busy like you are. Sure, you're busy looking for guests, they're busy doing other things, running a company or whatever it might be that attracts you to them. So you have to be mindful and respectful of the time. The best thing you can do, and this is what I've really taken, like this is how I was able to get Seth Godin as a perfect example. I'll just share how I did that. So because a lot of people have asked me, like I must have had 30 or 40 people email me and be like, how did you do it? Like, how can I get him? Can you give me his email address? People were asking. I was like, absolutely not. Like, so what I did is I was actually looking, because I know he publishes a lot of books. He's got 19 bestsellers or something like that. So I knew he'd have another one coming out. I looked around to see if I could find him talking about it. I found one. He mentioned The Practice coming out. So I looked around to find his publisher, whoever he's going to publish through, found the publisher, asked them for a galley of it. Can I get a pre-copy? I read the copy of the book. And then not only that, what I did is I actually knew another podcast that is a much bigger podcast. I just happen to know like some of their PR team. I've never been on the podcast or anything like that. Building a Story Brand with Donald Miller, which is a really fantastic show. But
I love Donald Miller.
It's amazing. So I actually reached out to their team and said, hey, I don't know if you know, but Seth Godin is having a new book come out. You guys should consider having him back on the podcast. It's been a few years. Turns out the whole team had flipped over and none of them knew Seth Godin. So I was like, I found his email address because I was actually able to do a little bit of research and find it. So I sent them his information with his permission. I emailed him. I said, hey, I read your galley. I'd love to have you on the show. This is my favorite part about the book. Really brief. It must have been 120 words. Like you can read in about 30 seconds. I said, also, can I please introduce you to the team at StoryBrand? I think that they would love to have you on. And I got a response very quick. Actually, let me take that back. I actually sent a video with this. And that's how I told him I wanted him on the show. I wrote up the part about having him on the other podcast. So really like what I did was I was a service to him. And I helped him get on 2 other podcasts that he was looking for an introduction to. He's just like, hey, if you know these people, could you help me out with that too? And so as soon as we got on a call, the first thing he said to me is like, you have been beyond helpful. He's like, I cannot believe how willing you were just to like help me like this. I'd love to be on your show and I'll come back later if you want me to, which was really cool. So what I did is I led with the value. It wasn't like, hey, I heard you have a book. I'd like to talk to you about it. I read the book. Here was 10 things that really stood out to me about it. I'd love to chat with you about it. Here's what I think my audience could take from it. Oh, and by the way, here's a really big podcast that would like to have you on. Do you want me to introduce you to them? And that's kind of the whole flow I use with just that guest. So for me, it's always individual. I don't have a framework, but it always starts with leading with value and keeping it really short.
Yeah, if there was a mic drop moment on this podcast, I think that was it. And I love the strategy that you used. And the theme here, guys, is be a catalyst. And you could see that he mentioned his goal is to connect people and the power of connection. And just by connecting Seth Godin and Seth Godin, by the way, is historically an impossible person to get on a podcast or do a live event. I mean, he is a really good person at saying no to things.
Yeah.
So by becoming that catalyst and giving him value, and then also letting him know that you had done some research, you had read the book, it's an amazing story and really impressive. And so then that guest was much deserved for you because you had circled the guest and created a way to empower him. And that is really an amazing value bomb that if you're listening right now, write that down. Become a catalyst. Okay, so moving right along, podcast interview etiquette is also one of the things that you're sharing in Podmatch, which I absolutely loved. Can you share a little bit about podcast interview etiquette? Because I know that there's people that show up and they're unprepared, or they, maybe are sending poor emails. Can you share a little bit about some etiquette tips that my audience could put into their workflow?
Yeah. So, you as the podcast host, right? Like we're talking to the host today. There's obviously a whole much longer list for the guest, but we're going to talk about the host today. For a host, what you want to do is you want to make sure that first off, somebody's comfortable. So I never start off recording. I've been on some podcasts where as soon as I join, it's already recording. They're like, hey, Alex, welcome to the podcast. I'm like, okay. All right. Yeah. I've actually had that happen 5 or 6 times out of 100 different podcasts this year. And, it's never super comfortable. Like as someone who's been a guest enough, like that doesn't really catch me off guard as much. But if I was brand new and this was my first podcast or maybe even my 10th or 20th, that would really freak me out as a guest. Now you've got me already kind of flustered. So it's going to be harder for me to actually like gain composure and have a really good interview. So I think the best thing you can do as a host is as soon as you get on, leave a few extra minutes, not 20 or anything like that, but a few minutes to be like, hey, we're going to start in a minute, but real quick, do you have any questions? Okay, how long? And I always ask this question. This is a really important one. How long do I have you for? How long do I have you for? And the reason I like to ask that, if they have a hard stop, they have another podcast in 30 minutes and they start saying it hit 28, 29, you didn't ask that question. They're like, oh shoot, how am I going to end this really fast? And they start getting really short with their answers and it's not quality. Now, if they say I've got 30 minutes and be like, hey, listen, we're going to go for about 28, but I promise I won't keep you a minute longer than that. They don't have to think about that. They can think about the content they're sharing. So for me, as the host, I want my guests to be calm and to know that, hey, this is a safe environment. I want you just to focus on what you're sharing. I'll handle the rest. And if it's somebody who's really new, I'll just tell them, hey, sometimes they're like the screen will go out, which you actually did with me. You're like, if the quality doesn't look good, don't let that phase you, right? Like you even said that because sometimes when it's streaming, it doesn't, but later on it looks good. So I explained that sometimes the audio go out for a minute, or if it shuts down, don't worry, I can save everything. We can just keep on going. It's not live. If you hate something, just tell me, we can edit it out. Like I go through all of that. And again, the whole idea is kind of make this guest feel really comfortable and welcome. And I actually recently got feedback. I had the opportunity to interview Kent, I'm blanking on this guy's last name, Kent somebody, but anyway, sorry, Kent. He came on the podcast and he asked me like a few questions about it and like was just wondering, okay, like what about this? And I explained all to him. When we were done, he told his publicist, who actually reached out to me and said you were the kindest podcaster he ever talked to. Like you made him feel really comfortable and really welcome. And that was the goal. Like I wasn't like over the top and like, can I bring you some food? Like it was remote, like or anything like that. Yeah. But it was, I really did enough to make sure that people understood, okay, here's the expectation. Here's what we're going for. And along with that, always explain the podcast a little bit if they haven't heard it. Like you can ask. Most of them are going to say no, and that's fine. But just ask. On the flip side, if you're ever a guest on a podcast, go listen to it at least a few episodes beforehand. I think that's a really valuable thing to do. But those are kind of some of my big tips I'd have for this, I'd say.
That's huge. I mean, what I'm hearing here is treat your guest as if they're a guest in your home.
Yes,
when someone comes to your house, you make sure that they're comfortable. Would you like anything to drink? Make sure you know where the bathroom is, make yourself at home. And I really love that comfortability factor because it also plays into some form of expectations. You need to set some expectations and say, hey, this is how the conversation is going to go. Just let them know a couple things about how you run your podcast, and it makes for a much better podcast. And I've been on so many podcasts where at the very end they say, all right, here's the question, and they drop this question that you weren't sort of expecting, and they sort of put you on the spot. I think if you have one of those like big monumental questions in your podcast that, before the podcast starts, let them know what the question is. So maybe in the back of their head, they can at least formulate some type of answer, because the worst thing that you can do is put somebody around on the spot and then there's dead air or the person feels uncomfortable. And I really love that. That's a huge tip, guys. You are bringing really the thunder today, my friend.
Thanks, man. That one is really important, by the way. I end with like, hey, do you have any final thoughts? I like to tell people that, like you're saying, exactly like that. I tell them, hey, I'm going to ask if you have any final thoughts, and then you comfortable with that. And most of them are like, oh yeah. And they'll like quickly write something down or look at something. So they actually say it. Cause when that's a common question that I hear on podcasts, and usually it's followed with a, yeah, I got something, right? Like, because they're like, oh, I wasn't thinking that way. But if you tell them that, they're like, cool, I got it. And they seem super smart. And then obviously it adds a lot more credibility. But anyway, and then, that's a really great, I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, I just wrote down asking how much time they have, because that's not something I've been doing. And I'm definitely going to add that in, because I've been on the other side of that. And I've felt that sort of
that pressure
fever of, okay, I don't want to be rude. How am I going to end this? I got to pick up my kids. But like, the conversation is flowing so well that it's not something you just want to completely cut off. So I'm absolutely adding that into my, pre-show ritual of having a short conversation, getting to know the person a little better. There's actually something called red light fever. And when people see that red light that's recording, this is from the music industry. When I was in the music industry, you could have a singer in front of a mic and they're like, okay, just warm up, get used to what you're going to do. And then you're like, okay, I'm recording. And they lose their mind because there's something that happens when you're being documented, as opposed to when it's just a free form conversation, that people just tend to lock up. So I really like, I would never just start recording, because I know Zoom automatically does that for people, but you need to have a little interaction. Right. And this is also going to be a big tip. We're talking about networking and becoming a catalyst. And it really sparked the thought of of this is another opportunity for you to become a catalyst before you start recording your interview, is maybe saying, I think that you'd really be a great connection for this person, and asking if they'd like that kind of introduction before the show. And again, that makes them feel more comfortable. You become more valuable, and you'll probably have a much better interview. So this has really been amazing. I feel like you have brought so many powerful tips to my audience, and I'm so grateful for that. You can find Alex at Creating a Brand Podcast, of course, Podmatch, which will have links to all this in the show notes, and of course, Creating a Brand. So I'd like you to talk more about creating a brand, because it's not something we spent a lot of time on today, but it's really an amazing resource for people. Can you share more about what you're doing there?
Yeah, so Creating a Brand is the name of the podcast, and creatingabrand.com is the website that goes along with it. So it's got the podcast on there. It's got we're getting ready to start a video, like a live version of the podcast. It's totally gonna be separate things. So the video will be on there, and then on the last thing we have is just my blog. Like I talked about my last day at my job and kind of the mindset I had to get into to make that shift in the first place, and things like that. So it's all around helpful content. And the last thing I do is I do 15-minute strategy calls with people. But really, it's just an extension of the service that I love to offer to people. And my main business behind all that is I do some coaching. And I don't do a ton of it because I'm really focused on Podmatch, but I'll take on a few people here and there if I really think I'm the right person to help. If not, I'm helping push them to somebody that I believe is right. But creating a brand has definitely been the foundation of what Podmatch has become, and kind of the name that I have in the industry has all come from this podcast, and just meeting people like you, Travis, along the way has just been so helpful.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm super excited to be connected to you. And how would you like people to reach out to you if they'd like to find out more about you, or if they'd like to interview you on their podcast? How would you like people to reach you?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do is everything is at creatingabrand.com. I make it pretty easy. My social links and stuff like that are all on there. If you can spell my name, you can go to alexsanfilippo.com. alexsanfilippo.com. That'll take you just straight to my Podmatch profile. And from there, you can click a button to interview me. You can see some of the questions I usually answer and things like that, and get an idea of what it looks like. But those are really the ways for people to reach out to me. And you can find me just about anywhere. I'm an open book. I love helping anybody I can. So if someone reaches out, they're going to be in good hands. Just make sure you let me know that you came from Travis, so I don't like cuss you out or anything like that. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that.
I don't think that you're cussing anybody out.
No.
Well, again, Alex, thank you so much. I've learned so much today, and this is why I love having these conversations, is because there's always so many people out there that are experimenting and learning and sharing new things, which is everything I'm about on this podcast, is sharing what's working right now for podcasters to apply in their lives. And you blew my mind here with everything that you shared today. And I'm definitely going to check out the book that you referenced, that Indistractable book. So thank you so much for being a wealth of information today on podcast therapy. And hopefully my listeners can realize that Podmatch is going to definitely give them painless connections to the right podcast guests. And it's you can try this out for free. So make sure you go create an account, watch some of the videos that Alex has put together to enable you to grow, find your voice, grow your audience, start your own podcast revolution. Thank you so much for coming on to Podcast Therapy.
Yeah, Travis, this was like a dream come true. I love the podcast and really enjoy what you're doing. So thank you for having me.